A few weeks ago we talked about a report into video game piracy ordered by the European Commission. Dutch company Icoris were given €360,000 to carry out the study in January of 2014. And their aim was to answer one question. Does copyright infringement affect legal sales of things like movies, music, and video games? And trust me, this is a hell of a lot more interesting than it sounds. The report was returned to the European Commission just a year later in May of 2015. Problem is, it was never made public. Why is that? Well, German MEP Julia Reda finally got her hands on this report in September of this year. That's more than 2 years later. And what she found in that report could explain why the European Commission never actually published it. The report suggested that not only does copyright infringement not harm legal sales of media, it might actually boost it. So this means that everything from YouTube re-uploads of full songs to video game piracy might actually be helping sales of the things that they're supposed to be ripping off. After the video that we made on this, Julia Reda's office actually got in touch with us to tell us more about it in a Skype interview, and that's what this video is. But it's not just that, there's a whole other thing going on here. You see, in that video we said this line: the EU has been trying to get ISPs to spy on user-uploaded content in the EU. Now this could be huge, and it's really why Julia Reda's office actually got in touch with us to help try and spread the word. This is a law that could be passed in Europe that essentially turns YouTube's Content ID system, which is terrible, into a legally enforceable thing, something that websites have to implement. That is, any website like YouTube with a lot of user-uploaded content, websites like Wikipedia, SourceForge and so on, spying on all of that user-uploaded content just to check for copyright infringement. But it's not just that, the YouTube Content ID system is already causing all kinds of headaches. This law could actually change that and set boundaries, legal boundaries that YouTube have to follow. They have no say in the matter. So this is obviously a huge cause for concern, and Julia Reda has already done a huge amount of work in this department. But let's start the interview with the whole piracy thing and that buried report, because that's where all this kind of kicks off. The first thing I wanted to know was, what exactly was this report supposed to be, and why was it commissioned in the first place?
Yeah, so in 2013, the European Commission decided that it wanted to start working on a copyright reform. And this is actually pretty overdue because the copyright laws that we have in Europe date back from 2001. So this is kind of a time where there was no YouTube and Wikipedia was just starting out. So it was a very different environment. So in principle, that was quite a good idea. And they started doing some research and commissioned this study, and the purpose of the study was to find out to what extent copyright infringement actually leads to less sales of legal content. And they looked at this for music, films, ebooks and games. And then, well, nothing happened. So the only reason why I know the study even existed is because the call for tender was public. And so I came across this years later and asked for it. Well, after a little bit of back and forth and them trying to postpone, they eventually released this study. It doesn't really show very much evidence of a displacement rate, but for me, the bigger problem is not what the study shows, but the fact that they never published it. They did actually publish a research article that was only reporting the results for blockbuster movies, because this was the only area where they actually found a displacement. And I think that's pretty disingenuous.
So that does kind of beg the question, did the European Commission actually bury this on purpose? Were they trying to hide it? Because that's what it sounds like.
Well, when I asked for the study, I didn't have any suspicions that there was foul play. But what made me suspicious afterwards was actually also seeing this study about the movie sales that they had published, I think a year ago. If they had actually forgotten that the study existed, then I don't think they would have published selectively these results about movies. So to me, this shows that it wasn't an accident.
So on to this proposed law then, the thing that makes Content ID a compulsory thing for websites as long as they've got a large amount of user-uploaded content. Why does the EU Commission want to do this? Why are they so keen?
The proposal, I think, came about because of lobbying from the music industry. The music industry kind of had a long ongoing conflict with YouTube, where in some countries YouTube didn't want to license the music. So what the proposal actually says is not that hosting providers or online platforms necessarily have to take out a license, but they say if users can upload content to your website, large amounts of content, whatever that may be, then you have to filter for copyright infringement. And this seems to have been inspired by what YouTube already does voluntarily, because they have Content ID, and we all know how well it works or doesn't work in practice. But of course, you can't write a law that only applies to YouTube. So they are basically taking this pretty flawed system that YouTube has and making it mandatory for all online platforms with user-uploaded content. They didn't think about the fact that there are all kinds of different platforms out there. Like, for example, platforms like GitHub or SourceForge, where people are uploading code. They would have to install those filters, because also software code can be a copyright infringement. Or Wikipedia, in fact, where users upload legal content that is under free licenses. But that doesn't matter. It's, what the proposal says is basically, if you have large amounts of user-uploaded content, you have to install those filters.
This is actually a bit terrifying, if you ask me, and it kind of made me wonder, has anything like this ever happened anywhere else in the world? Has any other country, any other government ever thought of doing this?
No, I don't think this has ever happened before. If you are responsible for everything that your users upload, then you would have to check every single upload manually before letting it appear online. So I think this rule, if it had existed 10 years ago, I don't think we would have seen the innovation on the internet that we have today. And we actually invited some different smaller platforms than YouTube to discuss this with us. And SoundCloud, for example, said, well, if this law had existed 10 years ago, then we wouldn't exist today. And I think this applies even more so to platforms like Wikipedia that are not even trying to make a profit in the first place.
Okay, so this is a really big deal, especially when you consider the effects it might have on innovation and the development of things online. But let's say this law does get passed and suddenly YouTube's Content ID system is a legally enforced thing. What would that mean for businesses like ours, small channels, big channels, and even the people who actually enjoy and consume that kind of content on YouTube and everywhere else?
So if you are creating content online yourself, then there's a pretty good chance that your own videos or texts or whatever would be taken down wrongly. So for example, if you're using footage of gameplay, quite often you're actually allowed to do that, because there are exceptions to copyright that, for example, for a review or for quotation, you're allowed to show small parts of the game you're reviewing just so people can see what you're talking about, and that's perfectly legal. But of course, an algorithm, a filter, cannot actually distinguish whether what you're doing is a review, whether it's a quotation, or whether you're just ripping off somebody else's gameplay. So I think it would be very likely that we would see a lot of automatic takedowns of videos that are not infringing copyright at all. And outside of YouTube, I think you would just see a lot less platforms that allow users to interact, because for the people who run the platforms, it would be a lot safer to moderate everything, to basically have you submit something for upload and then it gets checked by somebody before it actually goes online, just so they can shield themselves from liability. And what we've also seen with filters that already are used voluntarily is that they usually favor the big rights holders over the little one. So I've actually written a blog post about that, and one of the examples I found was an episode of Family Guy, where they took a YouTube video of a small YouTuber of the internet and included it in the Family Guy episode. And then, of course, the Family Guy episode was submitted to Content ID, and it detected the original video and took it down because, you know, it's including a section of Family Guy. At some point, there was a possibility that the Commission would actually present a progressive reform. At some point in 2014, they were saying, well, actually, copyright is too complicated for users to understand. And this dialogue, these ideas, they immediately triggered incredible pushback from the music industry and from larger film studios and so on. And so the Commission gave up this idea pretty quickly. What I've been trying to achieve in the European Parliament is not just to delete this content filter, but to introduce an exception for user-generated content that basically says, if you're using small parts of somebody else's work creatively, and you're making something new out of it, then that should be legal. And this is what we're fighting for at the moment. But of course, this idea of the content filter has gotten a lot more traction. And so I think it's really time to inform people who will be affected by this law, because it's very obvious that when the European Commission was writing this proposal, they did not have individual creative people on YouTube in mind. What they were thinking about were the people who just upload a song or a music video without any modification and are basically trying to rip off somebody else's work.
Here's where it kind of starts sounding like that it's just these older politicians, the older institutions, that they just can't keep up with how quickly things are moving online, and the development of technology, the development of websites springing up, the way YouTube has changed in the last few years is just mind-blowing when you think about it. It's really no surprise that the law and the people who make the laws can't quite keep up with all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think that's certainly part of the problem. Every lawmaker has heard of YouTube and Facebook, but not every lawmaker has heard of GitHub or SourceForge, for example. So they think that every platform that has large amounts of user-uploaded content is basically $1 billion multinational company that can afford to produce filters that can just magically get rid of all copyright infringement. And I think the other misunderstanding is that they overestimate what filters actually can do. They think that it's easy to identify whether something is a copyright infringement or not, because the use case that they have in mind is indeed somebody uploading an entire song and it belongs to some record label, and that's a pretty simple case. But for example, if you are translating a text, or if you are taking a picture of a 3D sculpture, that can be a copyright infringement, and it is not that easy to have some kind of filter automatically recognize that. So they are asking small companies that happen to have a large user base, or even platforms that are not companies at all, like YouTube, like Wikipedia, to develop filters that are incredibly costly and that are not as reliable as they think they are. And there are lots of examples out there of even Content ID failing, which is one of the largest companies in the world putting all of their engineering effort into it.
So, my last question, the big one, I guess. What are the chances that this will actually happen? What are the chances that the EU will be able to take YouTube's stupid Content ID system and turn that into something that has to be used by law?
There are two bodies that have to decide over this law. There's, on the one hand, the European Parliament, which is directly elected, and there you have some, especially younger members, who realize that this is not going to work the way they think it is. But it's a big conflict, because there are also a lot of people who just think that YouTube and Facebook have been behaving irresponsibly and we need to punish them by all means necessary. And I'm not saying that YouTube and Facebook are always the good guys, but the fact that they're maybe not paying enough taxes has nothing to do with copyright law. And it's all kind of muddled up here. So there, I think it really depends on whether your elected representatives actually hear something else, hear a different story, hear from people who are actually creating content on the internet who are not happy with this law. And that's why I think it's really important to contact your members of the European Parliament and tell them what the consequences of a law like this would be for the rest of the internet that is not YouTube, and for people who are not signed under a big record label. And on the other hand, there is the Council, which is the national governments of the EU, and there are very different opinions there. So it's mostly the big countries like Spain, Italy, France that are really behind this, and there are not so many states that have been speaking up against it very vocally. So for example, the UK hasn't really taken a position on it so far, so it would also be helpful to just have a public discussion about this, make sure that it's a topic that's in the media, so that your government will eventually find it necessary to take a position on this. Because if you have, on the one hand, really big countries saying this is a great thing and nobody really speaking up against it, then it's probably going to pass.
Well, cheers, Julia. That is pretty bleak, actually. But there you go, it's a huge issue. It's a very big topic and something that I think far more people should be aware of. It's certainly something that caught me by surprise and not something that I was ready for, to be honest. And if you're sat there thinking, hey, I'm not in the EU, why should I care? Well, it's quite obvious to me. First of all, a vast amount of content that you see on YouTube and other sites like Wikipedia comes from within the EU. It could have a huge effect on what you actually see on these websites. Not only that, it also gives you a sense of how politicians are actually thinking about this stuff, and the fact that the music industry still has an amazingly powerful lobby, one that can actually get things like this done. I mean, why do you think that YouTube even implemented their own content ID system in the first place? There you go, guys. That was our interview with the German MEP Julia Reda. Thank you very much, Julia, for your time, and thank you very much everyone who watched right through to the end. It was a very interesting topic, I thought, and it's definitely something that people should be aware of. Let us know what you think about it down in the comments. Remember to like the video if you enjoyed it, and please do subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this every day. There's another video right there which you could watch right now, and of course a link to Patreon if you want to support some more hard-hitting journalism like this in future. Just kidding. See you next time.